And good evening, everybody. This is, like I said, our first presentation for 2024. Tonight, we are going to be talking about a subject that I know a lot of you are interested in, the Asian jumping worm. This one goes a little bit outside of my own normal expertise, so I should introduce myself for those of you who aren't familiar with me. My name is Bob Bruner. I am the exotic forest pest specialist with Purdue University in their Department of Entomology. I have been an entomologist now for, I think, roughly 13, 14 years. I've had the opportunity to work with invasive species, starting with emerald ash borer when it first entered Indiana, through soybean aphid and several other critters, including spotted lanternfly, and now the Asian jumping worm. So, as an entomologist, I will admit I had to do a lot of my own personal research and learning to make sure I could understand what I was talking about when it comes to Asian jumping worm for the last year. It's been a topic of great interest that I've been talking to a lot of people about. It is a little unusual compared to our normal invasive species because it doesn't so much attack plants or commodities that we value. It really does most of its damage to the soil that we need. However, there are a lot of caveats to that, and tonight I'm going to try to go over all of them. So our first question when it comes to this is, what are we talking about? So what is the Asian jumping worm? Well, the name is actually a little bit of a misnomer. It is not a single species, rather a group of species that includes worms from the genus Amenthus and the genus Metaphyri. There may be others as well. The species complex, as we refer to it, kind of changes depending on what region you're in. But what we can rely on is all the organisms that are grouped under the moniker of Asian jumping worm. They all have the same ecology. They all have essentially the same biology. They may look a little different, but they're going to do the same thing. Now, they are similar to our European worms that we have all over North America, but their ecology is going to be the thing that sets them apart. Because normally, when we think about earthworms, we think that they're actually good for our soil and they help us out quite a bit. However, Asian jumping worms, who live in very similar ways to European worms, do not assist our soil and they are not good for our environment. They can actually do some pretty significant damage in areas where they have infested, which is why so many people are concerned about them. Now, I'm going to give you a little background information about worms in general, so that way we're all on the same page. And I need to make sure that I clarify some of the words that I'm going to use here, so that way I can avoid confusion. And it's going to start with talking about our native worms. So first off, when it comes to native worms, we have none. Most of our native North American species, especially in the Midwest, were eliminated during glaciation. So when glaciers covered portions of Indiana and other parts of the Midwest, those species that existed in the topsoil were essentially scraped away. There are a few native species left. They're pretty hard to find, and it would take someone far more specialized than me to be able to identify them, but I do know they are present. However, most of the worms that we rely on, like a nightcrawler or a gray earthworm or red earthworm, etc., these are European in origin. They were originally brought over here during colonization through a variety of means. Sometimes they were brought over in ship ballast. Sometimes they were transported along with potted plants. Regardless, though, we brought them here. We introduced them to this environment. Now, as we go through this program, I'm going to use the European nightcrawler as kind of my example of a European worm that we all know. Nightcrawlers are pretty ubiquitous throughout the Midwest. We use them to fish. We use them to help our soil. We see them on sidewalks, so we can all pretty easily understand a nightcrawler. Now, nightcrawlers share this kind of ecology that's shared amongst just about all of our European worms that we're going to be concerned with, the ones that you probably understand the best. So nightcrawlers are surface feeding worms, but they live deep down in the soil. So what this means is that nightcrawlers create channels throughout the soil down to burrows that they live in, and they will drag food from the surface, primarily leaf litter, plant detritus, that kind of thing, down into those channels and feed. So they're not getting their food in the soil per se. What they're doing is they're taking the food that's on top of the soil, that organic matter, and then they are consuming it, and then they're basically pooping it out, and what they poop out makes really, really healthy soil. We refer to it as castings. Their castings are very, very rich in somewhat digested organic material that gets recombined with the soil very easily. So they're really beneficial in that regard. Now, there are a few interesting pieces of information when it comes to that a lot of us don't realize. For example, I bet a lot of you didn't realize that our European worms that we love in gardens or when farming are actually pests in forest areas, and they can be detrimental. So these guys do have beneficial and non-beneficial services that they can give to an ecosystem, essentially. Where they are determines whether or not they're a problem. But for the most part, we humans, we gardeners, farmers, etc., we consider our European earthworms very beneficial. Now, our native earthworms, they are what's called hermaphroditic. They have both male and female organs on a single individual, but they still need a partner to reproduce. They're going to find another worm, they're going to mate. After they mate, they're going to produce eggs and store them in what's referred to as an egg cocoon. And these can hold somewhere in the neighborhood of about 10 eggs, and they'll produce 20 to 30 egg cocoons per year. Now, our European worms are actually fairly hardy. They're able to survive in ideal conditions up to 10 years. But when I say ideal conditions, we're talking about conditions in like a laboratory. In nature, due to the attrition rate they experience and just other environmental factors, they probably, I would guess, live more like 2 to 3 years. But regardless, these traits are going to set them apart from Asian jumping worms quite a bit. So that also brings up the question, what is the difference between these and Asian jumping worms? Well, I mentioned it earlier, but the primary difference is going to be the ecology of these worms. Oops, I skipped a slide there. So their ecology is going to really affect the quality of the soil. It's going to affect the ability of plants to grow. And I'm going to go back to that image a little bit to show you a little more. So this is soil that has been affected by Asian jumping worm. Asian jumping worm has been feeding here, and what you are seeing are their castings sitting on top of the soil. Now, you could probably guess that this texture of soil isn't very good to grow things in. In fact, those castings are very hard. They dry out very easily. They lock in nutrients very easily. They don't recombine hardly at all. And people often refer to those castings as leaving the soil with a coffee ground-like texture. Not a good thing to have. Now, this comes a lot from their position in the soil. Now, I mentioned just a little bit ago, European earthworms burrow deeply into the soil. We consider that beneficial because their burrowing practices help create more porosity in the soil. It allows water to be transported more easily. It allows gases to be exchanged. They tend to live around root systems of larger plants. So that means that those root systems are deriving a benefit of extra respiration and extra water transport, which will enhance their ability to transport nutrients as well. Asian jumping worms, however, they live in the first few inches of the topsoil. Honestly, they live kind of right on top of it. They will consume all the leaf litter that's sitting on top of the soil, the same stuff that our European worms are going after, and they will eat it at an extremely high rate. They're very, very voracious feeders, and they're very active. This means that they could strip out the topsoil leaf litter very quickly and essentially leave only their castings behind. So a little more on their castings. I mentioned this earlier, European earthworm castings tend to be very, very nutritious. They recombine with the soil very easily. They help bring back nitrogen and other things into the soil that our plants can take advantage of. Whereas the whereas the Asian jumping worm, their castings tend to lock nutrients in very tightly. They don't recombine with the soil very well at all. And in fact, we often see that since that's sitting on top of the soil, hydrological events are going to easily wash away those castings and carry them to other sources. So you can imagine, depending on where you live in Indiana, so I live in the kind of the west central, southern central area of Indiana and Terre Haute. And what we see here is that people have a lot of localized ponds in their areas, a lot of natural ponds that may exist there due to the hilly nature where we are. And as water flow moves things around, all of a sudden those castings will get swept into either storm sewers or into ponds and retention ponds, things like that. And then all of a sudden you have nitrogen and other materials that's just building up in there, creating a nasty situation where you could have an algal bloom. and those nutrients aren't serving the plants that they really need to. And I showed you this just a moment ago, and this is what you can look for when Asian jumping worm has been at work. I'm going to give you another picture here that more demonstrates what I'm talking about. So this picture comes from the Wisconsin-Madison Arboretum. These are the folks who originally began studying Asian jumping worm as they arrived here in the United States. And a lot of the information that I'm sharing with you this evening really comes from their hard work. What you're seeing here is on the left side of the picture is where Asian jumping worm has been at work. And on the right side is where they have not yet infested. So it's a very, very clear line of where they've impacted the soil and where they haven't yet reached. Now, the good thing is that most likely they've been removed from this soil by the folks at the Arboretum, and they're just taking a picture of this because normally Asian jumping worms typically very visible on top of the soil. Yeah, oftentimes you can't miss them. It's rather gross, and they tend to mass together. They aggregate in one place, and they're very, very mobile. Now, this kind of brings me to talking a little bit about their reproduction and their life cycle, because they have a much different life cycle as compared to the European worms that I've been referencing this whole time. So I mentioned that European worms can survive potentially 2 to 3 years in the wild. Asian jumping worms, under normal conditions, will only survive for a single season. They are not able to survive the hard freezes that we get throughout several portions of the Midwest. So when we get that first hard frost, just about all the adults are already dead. Their eggs, however, will overwinter very easily in our soil, in our compost piles, etc. They're able to survive those temperatures. And once soil temperatures begin to get above 50 degrees or whatever substance they're currently in, they'll hatch and you will have adult Asian jumping worms within 60 days. That's a pretty good turnaround time there. Now, I kind of mentioned a lot of this. One of the things that we have noticed with Asian jumping worm is they tend to go through boom and bust cycles, probably due to the nature of their feeding. They're worms, so they don't move long distances very quickly. They tend to aggregate together in piles. So they eat all of the material out of an area, and then they all just kind of die off because they consumed all their available food sources. So they'll go through that boom and bust when all the leaf litter and everything comes back, the population will grow, it'll get too big, and then they'll crash with that because there's no food. The other thing that we've noticed too is that climate change and warming temperatures may be impacting the number of generations we see in a season. When I originally wrote this slide, I was theorizing that we may see more than one generation in a season, maybe two. But now, from information I've been getting, I need to test this, but I believe we may be seeing potentially 3 to 4 generations in a season as temperatures go up and we have longer periods of time where it's going to be warm. For example, last year, I got calls as early as February saying that we were seeing adult Asian jumping worms because they're taking advantage of warm areas like internally warm compost piles over the winter. That means that the eggs can complete their portion of the life cycle faster and the adults can come out earlier. So while they may only survive for a single season, we're getting overall more worms in a season. So this brings us, of course, to identifying these. We want to be able to tell these apart so that way we know when we have a problem or when we just happen to see a random worm in our soil. And I actually get quite a few calls and emails about this now because people are very concerned. And I've had to sort a few things out because identifying Asian jumping worms isn't as easy as you think. Now, there are a few traits, that set them apart pretty easily. One of them is that Asian jumping worms live on top of the soil, so they can't really have pale colors to them. They'll burn in the sunlight too easily. Their skin typically is more melanized than that of a European worm that lives deeper in the soil. So you'll see that one side of their body, or maybe their whole body, tends to be much darker on average than a European worm. Now, their length can reach approximately 6 inches. Sometimes they'll get as long as 8, or they may even be much shorter than that. So it's really variable, and it's not a very trustworthy trait to use to identify them. However, one thing that sets them apart from all other worms is how mobile they are. They thrash. They are very aptly named. They will actually jump. They'll thrash their body so hard on the surface when they're disturbed that they will leap off of it. I was actually identifying some of them in my office while I was showing them to some grad students, and I poked one of these worms, and it quite literally leapt off of the plate that I was holding it on onto a chair nearby. So that gives you any idea of how active they can be. The other thing that we can use to tell them apart is the position and the structure of their clitellum. And you may ask, well, what is a clitellum? Well, I'm going to explain that here. Right now, what you're seeing is that organ being highlighted. On the left, we have a nightcrawler, and on the right, we have an Asian jumping worm. You could see those sets of segments that have the red circle around them, they look a lot different between those worms, don't they? So the clitellum is the organ that is producing the eggs and the cocoons. That is where they store their reproductive organs. That's where all of their egg laying is going to be occurring. On the nightcrawler, you've probably seen it before. It's this reddish brown saddle-shaped bit that's kind of halfway or most of the way wrapped around their body, kind of like a cuff. Whereas on an Asian jumping worm, it's going to just look like a set of segments that are differently colored from the rest of the body, and it's just going to be flush to the body. So it's just going to look like a few segments that are different colors. And you're not going to see, for the most part, anything that's very raised, though I have found a few moments where I've seen exceptions to that, where it may look a little bit puffier than the surrounding scales. I suspect that might be due to when female, or I'm sorry, not female, but when worms have where they're gravid, where they may actually be building up eggs and getting ready to lay eggs. But again, that's me speculating. I need to test that to be sure. So another trait that sets them apart from pretty much all other worms in the continental United States is that all worms have what we refer to as setae, tiny hairs or bristles that facilitate their movement through soil. So if you look at our European worms have 8 setae on a segment. And they use these setae or bristles, which have very particular positioning. That's how we could tell apart a lot of different species. They use those bristles to move through the soil. So they'll extend them as they move their body to help them get a grip to keep moving. Asian jumping worms, what sets them apart is that they have a full ring of these bristles around their body, about 40 altogether on an individual segment. So that means that their ability to grip the soil is incredible as compared to the European cousins. And it also means that if they want to thrash or move around, it gives them a lot of grip to be able to do so. And this behavior is from their desire to ward off predators. If you ever see it, it'll honestly probably freak you out a little bit. It's a very, very weird thing to see if you've never seen an Asian jumping worm before. And these traits combined will help you identify them. But what I want to encourage all of you to do is that if you are not sure, email your local extension educator. There is one in every county in Indiana, or you can use my contact information. Send me pictures and I can help you out. All right, so the thing that we all are probably here to talk about is how do we prevent these from getting here? We do not want Asian jumping worms anywhere, so what do we do to try to prevent them? Well, first, we need to understand how they got here. So there are a few different methods of entry, and unfortunately, they all involve human movement. We transport them by accident. Sometimes we transport them intentionally. So Asian jumping worms are transported primarily through soil products that contain soil or through compost or mulch. Oftentimes, now, while I have not yet had anyone call in finding them in potted plants, I have gotten many calls and contacts about finding them in compost and mulch. I would say that most likely Asian jumping worm, at least in Indiana, moves primarily through the transport and sharing of compost and mulch. What we want to make sure we do is we need to stop doing that, or we need to verify that whatever we are getting when we purchase this, they are using proper techniques to be able to sterilize that mulch. You can always talk to whoever your provider is if this is something you're concerned about. And if they can't tell you something similar to, we heat it for a certain amount of time to about 130 degrees, if they can't share with you their process and how they sterilized it, most likely you don't want to purchase your mulch from that person, because that means they probably are not using sterilization techniques at all. So you want to make sure that you source out everything as best you can. And one thing that I want to emphasize too is that you should check your own if you are making this, because we may have the best intentions in the world when we work with our community gardens and other places, but we don't want to accidentally give them contaminated compost or soil. And unfortunately, I've gotten a lot of information from folks about community gardens getting contaminated with Asian jumping worm. Another thing you can do is when you are transplanting live plants, maybe consider using bare rootstock and avoid potted plants. But I think that also, if you just take care with your potted plants, you can always check the soil. It is a potted plant. There's not a whole lot of soil there. You can always check it to make sure there are no live worms, and you can always repot the plant. Asian jumping worms do not consume plants. They don't lay their eggs on plants. They lay them in the soil. So if you just wash off the roots of a plant, repot it, you're probably going to be okay. Another thing that I would also ask people to consider is we live in the Midwest. And I'm sure a lot of us have heard the story that when someone wanted to put in a new garden, like your grandmother or something, they just talked to their neighbor and their neighbor brought over some black soil that they had from one of their fields. That's a good way to transport these. So we need to be mindful that when we are sharing, when we are transporting them, we have got to be sure we are sourcing them and checking this to make sure that we're not bringing them over to someone else's home. Now, someone here is asking a really good question. This is one I've never been asked before, so I think this is really interesting. Do we need to be concerned about sharing leaves raked from the yard? Honestly, I would say probably not. So yes, they do live in the topmost layer of the soil, but I think by the time you're raking leaves and everything, the worms have either moved on or died off. I have not yet seen moments where infestation has been in the leaves themselves, like if you rake them together, because the worms, if you disturb them, they're going to run. They're going to go to where they can hide. So the minute you start raking the leaves, they're scattering. And I just don't see that being a super big concern if you're trying to share leaves there. One thing that I would consider is if you're really worried about it, maybe like shred the leaves, mulch the leaves a little bit without the soil involved with it. I know a lot of us are dealing with oak leaves, and oak leaves don't break down very easily. So you may want to be just doing that practice anyways, depending on what you're sharing and how you're doing so. But I think the raked leaves, you don't need to worry about quite yet. Now, that keep in mind, there's still more research we need to do on that. And I may change that later. But for right now, I think you're okay with that. And I see someone is asking, is bagged mulch from home center safe? I can either say yes or no to that one. I think it would be a very good idea to double check the mulch and make sure before you use it. Now I'm going to get to just a little bit here on what you can do to try to sterilize mulch and stuff like that as you get them. It's very close. So let me just get through this next bit. All right. So like I said, most of the instances of Asian jumping worm that I've found have come from mulch and compost and things like that. And like I said, it's been shared with community gardens, and we tend to share things a lot as gardeners. So now we need to make sure that what we share, we are sourcing out. Part of the reason that the mulch or compost has been such a big problem is that we are doing good practices with them. And those practices involve keeping them internally warm as they go through the winter, because that way they're going through biological reactions. They're helping break down nutrients. So by the time we are getting to the next season, it's ready to go. That's what you're supposed to do. But unfortunately, that means that any Asian jumping worm that is in that is now able to complete its life cycle faster because we kept it warm throughout the months where they're supposed to be quiet. And you could see where this could go. Other things that are problems when it comes to preventing Asian jumping worm, you may hear these worms referred to a lot of different names, such as Alabama jumpers, crazy worm, snake worm, wood eel, and all sorts of other things, because they are sold in bait shops and by businesses that tout themselves as being vermiculture business. I've even seen websites that will say, well, Asian jumping worm is called invasive, but there's not really enough information to say that they're detrimental. Folks, that's just not true. There is plenty of information. These are not beneficial to you in any way. Do not buy Asian jumping worm. Don't use it when you fish. Unfortunately, what I see a lot of folks do is they'll buy it as bait, thinking they're good, but then when they're done using it, they'll dump the worms out wherever because they're worms, right? So please don't purchase these. It only adds to the problem. So how do we detect them? How do we know that they are present? I told you all the horror stories, but now how can we know that they are present? So first off, look for soil that's going to resemble coffee grounds. That means Asian jumping worm has been present. Doesn't mean they're present right now, but it'll tell you that they've been there before. Worms also tend to aggregate. Oftentimes, you can just find the worms by looking at the soil, and you will just straight up see a horrifying mass of worms just sitting on the soil. And pretty much none of our European worms will have that behavior. That's a very easy way to identify them. In fact, I believe, and I need to verify this, but I believe someone on campus found some as well. And that's something I'm going to be doing here in the next month, is verifying that we have an infestation. There's also something known as the mustard test, where you mix a third of a cup of ground hot mustard seed into 1 gallon of water, and you pour that volume slowly over a 1 square foot area. You pour half of that volume, I'm sorry. And what this will do is it's very repellent to the worms living in the soil, so it will force all of them to the surface. Now, it doesn't hurt anything. It's not going to do any damage to the soil. It's probably not even going to hurt the worms. It will just be very, very repellent to them. They'll come up to the surface. Now, keep in mind, this will reveal any worm, not just jumping worm, but it's a very easy way to check, say, a potted plant or maybe a mass of soil that you're trying to work with. Now, this leads me to our next thing, though. How do we eradicate them? How do we get rid of Asian jumping worms? Unfortunately, I don't have a whole lot of good news here. There are no chemical treatments for Asian jumping worm. And I have heard some people talk about some crazy home brews that they put together to try to eliminate them. Folks, that's incredibly unsafe. You don't know what that's going to do to your soil. You don't know what that's going to do to you. And on top of that, it's also illegal. It violates federal law. So please do not attempt to homebrew a pesticide to get rid of them. And do not attempt to use a pesticide labeled for something else to get rid of them, because you may do more damage to the soil than you intend to. Now, there is some information about using fertilizers that contain saponin, so fertilizer mixed with tea leaves, essentially, to try to repel the worms out of the soil. That research is ongoing right now. It is not yet firm. I think there may be some positive science with it, but I have not heard enough yet to say yay or nay to that one. And I will keep you up to date as we learn more. Now, worms can be handpicked and disposed of out of the soil. You can put them in a trash bag and heat treat them, where you just leave them in the sun for a while. As long as the bag gets nice and hot, usually about 105 degrees, that'll kill the worms and the eggs. And then they can be safely composted after that, as long as they're dead. You can also say, someone was asking, is bagged mulch or compost safe from a home center? Well, what you can do is, when it's nice and warm outside, put that bag, wrap it up in tarp completely, put it in your driveway, make sure the temperature gets above that 105-degree mark, and the worms in those bags will die, and so will their eggs. The big thing is they need to be completely enclosed, because if you don't, the worms will escape out of any holes or anything else to go where it's cooler. And that's probably the most effective method we have right now for killing them, if you're worried about individual amounts of compost and etc. Now, this is the part where people kind of hate me. When it comes to sales and exchanges and community gardens, there are a lot of different conversations going on amongst different extension services and universities about the best way to approach this. And right now, we are all, I think, still kind of looking for the best answer. But right now, the things that I can tell you is, it's good to not share plants from known contaminated sources. I think that kind of goes without saying. If you are doing community gardens, you need to be monitoring everything that comes in and everything that goes out. And that's just a practice you should already be investing in. That way you can, if someone brings compost or soil, you can make sure that you can eliminate what's in there before it ever gets there, and make sure you turn that one away from your garden. Or if you're at an herb market and someone has potted plants, go through and check those plants. Or if someone's bringing in compost, check that compost before you put it out there for sale. And of course, we have a lot of master gardeners on this call right now. You've just learned a bunch about Asian jumping worm. You've been educated, you've seen how to identify them, and you can help report them and help educate the public. And of course, discourage your friends from buying these. don't bring them in intentionally. That's going to help quite a bit to try to reduce the chance of these getting spread around. Now, I'm going to say that we are still learning a lot about Asian jumping worm, and a lot of this is what I've been able to put together over the course of the last year. I just submitted a publication that should be available to you here very shortly. So it just has to go through an approval process. So you should be able to pull one offline to be able to look at it. And I'm also going to be talking about this a lot as we keep going on and we discover more. Primarily what I'm looking for is I want to know who sees Asian jumping worm first as the season develops going into 2024. All right, so a little bit for some reporting and helpful information sources you can use. So we've got the Purdue Plant Doctor. This is a great website to help you with plant issues, and I myself added in information on Asian jumping worm to this to help you identify it. So let's say you just type in Asian jumping worm into that search bar right there at PurduePlantDoctor.com. It will take you to some information on Asian jumping worm, and this website will just help you find out different issues that could be going on with your plants. You can also report these at a few different sites. I like edmaps.org. You can put up pictures. You can say where you were when you found them. And if you go there, you'll note that folks over in Bloomington are real good about reporting moments of Asian jumping worm, and there have been quite a few sightings of it over there. You can also call 1-866-NO-EXOTIC to report things. However, that is the hotline for the Indiana DNR. They're the regulatory arm when it comes to controlling invasive species in Indiana. But unfortunately, Asian jumping worm is not a regulated organism in our state, not yet. So it might be best if you simply email me any information you have on Asian jumping worm, if you've seen them, or if you have questions, etc. So I've got my contact information up here that will help you get to me when you want to talk about this or maybe get something identified. You can also look at the different social media and other things I have, as well as the Purdue Landscape Report, where I put some articles out there on Asian jumping worm. So some of the questions that I see some of you've been throwing in the chat here, let's make sure we get to all of them. So one question I've gotten, could you till the top inches of the soil and heat with a hand torch to kill the worms and eggs? You could, however, I'm fairly certain that is not legal because that may fall under our prescribed burning laws that we have here in Indiana. That one, I'm not sure that you could legally do. I would need to double check that before saying yes. I think it might be easier to simply till the top inches of the soil and use a shovel to remove the worms because they really do tend to mass together. And then just keep doing that for probably a period of a couple of years. Just go through, remove the worms physically, take the soil and solarize it. You can dig it out, solarize it to kill the eggs, and then put it back in. And I obviously would want to somehow try to quarantine that area of the soil to make sure they don't spread from there. And then I see, will single-digit temperatures outside kill their eggs? Unfortunately, no. The eggs are laid into the soil itself, like they're under leaf litter, they're under in compost and things like that. So they're fairly well protected. Now, if they're exposed, they may suffer some attrition, but their eggs are pretty resilient when it comes to cold temperatures. Warm temperatures kill them much more easily. So another question here, can you tell us which counties have identified Asian jumping worm? So this is information that I am still gathering. This is actually a little bit more challenging because we just weren't as conscious of it as we should have been. Several of the more southern counties in Indiana do have Asian jumping worm. So that includes places from Vigo through Vanderburgh and other places down here. Monroe County and Marion County, I've also gotten information on them being there. I have reason to believe they are also in Tippecanoe County as well. It may not be that big a stretch to say that probably quite a few counties in Indiana have it. We just may not be aware of it, which is why I'm encouraging all of you to please report if you find them. Email me, let me know. That way I can put together a map. And then I see, are some counties more vulnerable than others, or is it everywhere in the state? I don't have a good answer for that one yet. I think that all of our counties are equally vulnerable to this because, I mean, we have gardeners in all these counties. We have master gardeners, community gardeners who are doing all these things. And unfortunately, we're still trying to catch up to try to get them identified. So are the worms that we see now on rain days European worms? Yes. Yes. If you see worms out like on sidewalks, those are almost certainly your European worms. I've not heard anything yet about Asian jumping worms sharing that behavior, but I am going to caveat that with I haven't heard that yet. There's more information that needs to be collected there. But I think that most likely you're seeing European worms do that because what they're doing is that the burrows they use have just gotten flooded with water and they're trying to dry themselves out a little bit so that way they can survive and then go back into the ground. Let's see, would covering raised beds with plastic or plywood kill them over the winter? No, I think that would actually enhance their ability to survive over the winter. If the raised bed were exposed to colder temperatures, that would probably help keep their population down if you're concerned about them being present. If you covered them, I think that you would be trapping warmth in the raised bed, which would actually enhance their chance of survival. And if you're concerned about a raised bed having Asian jumping worms, then, I mean, honestly, just clear out your raised bed. If it's already winter, you're probably not developing much in there and just replace the soil. Will going through a chicken's digestive tract kill the eggs? I don't know. That's a really good question. However, one thing I would consider is the only way that a chicken would be able to consume them is that the chicken would have to be consuming mulch and compost, unless you're giving the chicken like a whole worm to try to eat, then I mean, I just don't have a good answer on that one. See, are the eggs or cocoons from worms visible? No, unfortunately. Well, okay, that's not quite true. The eggs of an Asian jumping worm resembles a mustard seed. Yes, they are visible. You need a hand lens or a microscope to be able to see them. The trouble is identifying them from the other particles in the soil. So if you look at some of the information that's hosted by the Wisconsin Arboretum, they have pictures of them even. I can't imagine the amount of work they went through to confirm that what they were looking at was an Asian jumping worm egg cocoon, because they're almost indistinguishable from soil particulate. If a plant from contaminated soil is transplanted to a sterile medium, could roots still be infested with eggs? No, because the roots never were infested with eggs. So they don't lay their eggs on the roots of plants. They live too high in the soil. They're primarily on the surface. Their eggs are kind of laid on the surface amongst the leaf and plant detritus there. So if you're talking about like on a potted plant, most likely they aren't real far down in the soil. And all you'd have to do if you're worried about it, say like if you just remove the plant from the soil and then you're concerned, well, did I get eggs on them, is just rinse them off. Rinse all the soil particulate off of the root system, and then you should be able to put them in a sterile medium and have a fairly low chance of seeing them appear in that. Let's see. And I see, Jessica, you're saying, I'm pretty sure I have them in my raised beds in Clark County. Will they compete with European worms already there? Okay, so, I mean, you have a raised bed. So if you have worms in your raised bed, like European worms, then, I mean, they're consuming the same food. They're consuming the leaf litter that sits on top of the soil. One is just dragging it into their burrow. The other one is just eating it right on top. So yes, you are looking at the potential for competition there. However, if you're talking about raised beds, then again, that's something where you may just, if it's depending on the time of year, you could just replace the soil and eliminate the issue and then sterilize that soil later on or get rid of it in other ways. All right, that was a lot of questions there. Do we have any more? Okay, so I'm going to include those questions because those were really good in YouTube. So say hi to YouTube, everybody. That way, people who also weren't able to attend this evening will be able to see that. Otherwise, that is my presentation for the evening. So for those of you on YouTube, please feel free to contact me using the information you see in front of you right now. I am happy to answer your questions. I'm also going to try to put a few links in the description of the video below that you're probably able to see right now.